and welcome. Today I'm joined by my guest Neil Kobold from PayProp. How are you doing, Neil?
I'm very well, David. Always a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to have you. Now, you do give me notes before these things, and I want to give you your full title. You are PayProp UK's Managing Director, extensive experience in the UK property sector. And what fascinated me is that you describe yourself as an active prop tech evangelist.
I do. I mean, I think we have to wade through some of these solutions nowadays. Not every prop tech that comes to the market is right for everybody. But I think that prop tech, and we take what the word prop tech was, it was to take a process and streamline it and make it more efficient for the industry. And I think when that is done well, there is nothing more beautiful. And it doesn't matter whether that product is front end, prospecting, dealing with admin, or even if it's just dealing with, employee engagement, just something that is done really, really well. That excites me, that when a product comes out and it can make a process and engagement, somebody's view of our industry better and more streamlined. I think that's what we should be really looking for.
Because it has that effect across the board, doesn't it? It raises standards pretty much for everybody.
Yeah. And that's why I think prop tech done well. However, on the other side, prop tech done poorly can end up as feeling like we've got the next shiny toy and it not actually fulfilling all of that excitement we had when we brought it on board. So I am an evangelist, but of the good products. And I think that you need to be more selective than you've ever had to be in finding actually those really good products that are right for your business.
Well, there's a seamless segue set up if ever I've seen one. Talking of good products, let us now turn to PayProp. We've got some really interesting sort of talking points today. But there's a sense out there, Neil, that the changes with banks, and it's been well documented that agents have found themselves after many years of just operating client accounts regularly as they would do. Nobody's saying that anything untoward has happened. The banks have simply en masse changed their attitude to the way that they see agency as a potential risk. It's not regulated, so there's no real guarantees out there. We do have things like CMP, which have been brought in. But again, you will only get CMP if you've got a client account that can be signed off properly. And the banks are not giving those out anymore necessarily to everyone that walks through the door. However, there are solutions out there. And amazingly, I mean, I've seen you guys everywhere, and I keep my ear very close to that prop tech ground. And the statistics sort of speak for themselves. You've got some fantastic results there in terms of the amount of people that are using PayProp and trusting you guys to literally process thousands of property accounts every single day. Did you see this coming, or is this the perfect storm?
I'm not going to say the regulatory framework hasn't benefited people like ourselves, because it has, but that was never why we did it. The need for a client account, and if you just need a client account, you don't necessarily need PayProp. You need an account. And actually, if all you're looking for is an account, we've helped people and signpost people to banks that are still helping them get an account. What we're about is that account then having all of that automation, as we talk about that prop tech, that taking that service to the next level, but also answering questions around compliance and the service that you offer to your customers. So there's all of that we kind of put with it. So we're not just a client account. However, the removal of the client account has caused a lot of people to say, okay, if I'm going to get a new client account, is there something I can get out that actually improves the service? And that's where we have benefited. But I still speak to a customer, if they've lost a client account and all they want is a client account, we might not be the right solution for them.
So what advice would you then give to people who are finding their client accounts shut down? I mean, what can letting agencies do to protect their businesses? Is there something that we could be doing to be proactive about it? Because some people haven't had that dreaded letter yet, have they?
No, and this is not going to make people feel any better, but unfortunately, it is not something that as an agency, it is typically within our control. What you need to do is make sure that you have very robust procedures around your due diligence, around how you handle client money, not just to the level of what AML may or may not require to you, but thinking of it from a bank's point of view. This all stems back from still pre-Brexit part of EU, and we started to see AML legislation coming stronger and more frequent. And one of them actually said that undesignated client accounts shouldn't be with a non-regulated entity. And that's where this risk now comes from, because we're not regulated. There's no way for us to be regulated. I met with HMRC recently, and they've got people who don't need to be regulated trying to register with them just so they can say we have an overriding legislation. And that's causing bottlenecks. But ultimately, what the banks are wanting you to do is evidence that you can operate as a regulated entity. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of smaller agencies, 100 to 200 properties under management, to take that burden also doesn't, the burden to operate as a regulated entity,
there are
operate 200 accounts,
there are costs associated with that as well, just in terms of the annual audit that you'll need to go through. I mean, look, there's every sense there that agents should be doing an audit anyway, but if you need an official audit for official purposes, it comes with a bit of a bonus, doesn't it? Yeah.
And the fact at the moment is we haven't got any banks saying that they're doing this. So the statement from banks and from approaching UK finance is that there is no overriding shutting of client accounts. However, our experience is different. And it differs then from branch to branch, even within. And you don't know what questions are being asked. Is it they've got to lower their risk profile and we're easy targets? There's many speculations that people have had. All we know is current legislation makes it difficult for an estate agent to hold an undesignated client account. We're no different. It's not a case that suddenly PayProp was there and our relationship with the bank that we can have the client account. We have that same burden, but because we have so much and we've kind of aggregated, it makes sense for us to follow that regulatory framework on behalf of our customers. And that's really it. It's no, magic wand that it doesn't apply to us. It's applying to everybody. It's just how we navigate it. And it's one of the reasons why I think ROPA was first so welcomed, because that regulation of property agents would have taken that headache away. Unfortunately, as we've seen, that's gone into the long grass. And the things that we're seeing with the rental reform bill are more that piecemeal adjustment rather than the overall legislation that would have helped with this issue.
Well, we're going to return to that in a little bit, but I mean, if we're talking about piecemeal sort of moves that are being made just incrementally to alter the way that we work, one of the things that has hit the headlines recently is the government's Housing Loss Prevention Advice Service. That's a catchy acronym waiting to happen right there. But they're going to provide legal advice to anyone facing eviction, not just those tenants who qualify for legal aid, which is slightly different to the status quo hitherto. This, some might interpret as being yet another step that makes life difficult or unpalatable for landlords. You guys are at the sort of business end of where it counts for landlords, getting the payments into their accounts. What's your view on this?
Well, look, the cynic in me could say that this is to coincide with the changes that we can see happening on the rental reform, because there has been some arguments there that it is going to be difficult for a tenant to navigate these changes as well as a landlord. That actually understanding what the different sections will mean, the changing of it and how that will affect them during an eviction. There has also been some claims from some of the lobbying groups on behalf of tenants that some of the things don't have any teeth because tenants won't understand their legal framework. So say a landlord uses a section 1 or 1A to get the property back, there's a certain length of time before they can go back in the property, but once the tenant's out, who's going to monitor that? There's a view that this housing loss prevention could make people second guess misusing some of those. I think it is probably got some benefit to it, but it depends if it is used well, or unfortunately we've seen previously, sometimes we've seen some of these things misused. If it is used to make sure that tenants understand their rights and the process they're going through and help them to adhere to that, I'm all for that. If, however, it is used to elongate eviction processes and inform tenants of the ways that they can make a process longer or more costly to a landlord, then that should be something that we really make sure doesn't happen. Because we've already got a perfect storm within the courts and the change and the removal of Section 21. And this is about making it right for both parties. Landlords should also have a way to get their property back when something is wrong. Tenants should be able to know what their rights are and follow it legally. But we need to balance that for both.
And I think for those solutions to work best, you do need buy-in from both the groups, not just one. So you can't just have something that overrepresents tenants or overrepresents landlords, but something that will take the views of landlords, agents, and tenants into account, because ultimately it has the best chance of succeeding if an agent's able to actually say to a tenant, listen, look, there is that, you know, service there for you to use. It might be able to give you some advice, but an agent will never find themselves giving that advice to a tenant if they feel that it's actually counter to their position. So it's an interesting balance.
Go get your advice, and on advice it says, look, this is going to go to court and you are going to be evicted. Don't wait to be evicted. Go find a new property now, because this is completely within their rights and everything here stacks up them using this ground. Then that's great. That's almost, then it becomes like a pre-court mediation service that allows the tenant to know this is going through and they are doing everything within their rights. Unfortunately, as we've found with some tenant services, what has happened is this is how you can hold out until the last possible time, costing the landlord or the agent or any of the people involved in the property cycle extra money. That wouldn't be welcome. So I think it's all going to come down to not this prevention service or the advice. I think everybody's worry is, what will the court capacity be like if we no longer have accelerated possession and everything must go through court?
Very true.
How do we make sure that that happens in a speedy fashion where it needs to, protecting all parties? And that's where I don't think anybody quite yet has had a view that, okay, I see how that is going to work.
Because those courts famously are still playing catch up. We're still sort of hanging on from that post-COVID era, and it's still
not even that. We're still hanging on. We can't recruit enough judges.
Yeah,
you know, I speak to David over at JMW.
Yep.
Provides a lot of advice into the Lettings Industry Council, and we did a round.
Right. Yeah.
One of the things that he mentioned was at the last round they wanted 100 and they got less than 50. So if you can't even get 50% of what you know you need to get to deal with capacity, and you're now going to increase capacity, it's not a difficult maths question to realize something there's got to give.
So I think in the lettings industry and certain pockets of the property industry, we find ourselves almost acting as ancillary services to government. So there, you know, AML is something that we very much have had to take on board. So we're seen as being that first line of defense in terms of checking people's finances, and so on. And then, you know, before that, controversially, we had the whole right to rent checks that were being done, and we all felt like we were being asked to become a little bit like an extension of border control. And you know, these things are not to be ignored. The government promises massive fines for letting agents and landlords who knowingly rent to unauthorized immigrants. The question with this being so politicized at the moment is it really the industry's job to check a person's right to rent? Is that something that we should be doing? We've been forced to do it, but is that right?
So I think, and I've always felt this, there are certain things that actually benefit our industry. And the more we are made to be the compliance checkers, then the more a landlord needs a professional agent who can make sure that that is done well, navigates the legal guidelines, and makes sure that no fines are incurred. That I understand. However, we cannot then be the person that checks if the documentation is legitimate and become, as you say, de facto border control for trying to figure out whether that license or that visa has been forged. That's not the expertise of a property professional. So we should have correct procedures, guidance, and things to go through to make sure that we've followed the correct due diligence on that. But I think that underlying, if somebody is being a level of criminality, cannot always fall onto the agent to have to find that. I think that becomes unfair. And that balance is, I think, difficult to find with things like the right to rent check. And especially when you then see some of the fines that are levied, where things are done, and it's always difficult to understand whether that was actually a procedural issue or actually was that the documentation that they were provided. And I think that is where people would like some clarity, because if you're making sure that I make the person give me the information, and if that information is seemingly valid, I have followed my procedure, as opposed to they give me that information and I now need to be a fraud expert and be able to inspect all of that documentation and decide whether that is legitimate or not. I think that's where we have this. And whenever they bring in anything new legislation, I think that's the guideline. We're property experts. If it's something that we should be deemed to be providing advice as an expert on, then that's fine, but we're not border control. So knowing whether the visa stamped on a passport is valid, unedited, or able to use to be set, or the settlement letter is valid and not a forgery, that's not within our expertise. Knowing what they should provide for a property and what a landlord should be asking for, that's the expertise that they're coming for.
Yeah, and I think it would also be, I suppose, a much better business environment for a tenant to be able to walk through the door of a letting agency without really feeling like the guys in there are going to be scrutinizing them on that sort of level. You're going to purchase a service at the end of the day. It's an essential service, it's a roof above your head, it's everybody's human right, but you know, there is work that goes into it, and sometimes we have, in any event, the propensity to walk into a bad relationship with a client because we have to ask difficult questions. That can be the start of it, can't it?
And it can. And I mean, if we look at, and it'd be interesting to look at the statistics, and it's not something that I have access to, but I'm pretty sure it's something the government will be able to assess. When they relaxed the right to rent and allowed us to deal it in a digital manner, did they see more failures? Were there more people providing wrong information, or actually did that speed up the service and actually have no knock-on effect? I mean, that'd be the kind of stats that I would hope somebody's looking at when they look at these things, because again, procedure for procedure's sake, when it is something like that, as you said, a right of somebody to have a roof over their head, that's when it becomes problematic, because you feel that they're just putting stumbling blocks in the way sometimes, and you're not quite sure of the benefit. You know, everybody's got the EPC, and it's now was relaxed on the update, and everybody did it because what it was said. But now if you look at, we've got it on our survey results, how many people actually ask for an EPC? How many people evaluate it? Where we've got more than 230,000 non-compliant EPCs currently, no enforcement. So what's actually, for the people who are going through all these hoops, what does it actually mean?
Yeah,
and I think that,
and are we being put through those hoops with no, where you've got sort of, you know, regulatory bodies that don't have the resources or the teeth really to necessarily police it properly? You're right, there is that sort of disjointed balance there, but I think it sets the tone for wider discussions that are happening within the industry about changes that are going to be brought in. And you guys are, as ever, ahead of the curve in trying to go out there and getting people's opinions. Now, I know you can't talk about it officially because the results are not yet collated, but you must have some indication. You had a survey where people could have their say about the latest renters reform bill and the changes that were being rumored to be coming into force. How's the take-up been? Have you had much?
Oh yeah, we've had a phenomenal response, and just over half were actually from PayProp users. The rest have actually come from the industry. So we didn't want it just to be the people who use PayProp and so talk about compliance or even the money handling side of it, having already got our solution. We wanted it to be a wider industry. It's no shock that I think overall regarding the Renters Reform Bill, the underlying views are quite negative. There's a lot of sentiment out there that it's yet another reason for landlords to exit the market in an already difficult time where we've not seen it. There's a lot of people wondering about costs. I mean, only just a lot of businesses found their way from the tenant fee ban because it needed them to change the business and get a new model. It now sees something else because, I mean, if you're charging a fee for a certain period of time, but the tenancy no longer has a time frame, could be as little as 2 months, it's going to involve us as an industry, again, going through a change, and that'll have a cost. So there's a lot of people worried about that cost. And then I think one of the other overriding sentiments is this the end? And I think that is the worry that kind of sits there, that we seem to be a death of 1,000 cuts, that it's this change, then this change. And that's almost why I think a lot of people would like the regulation, because it would put it under one umbrella. It would give us one kind of legislation to kind of sit to, but also it would put everybody on an even, because you've got people who fully adopt every single thing that comes through. But as we experience by the people that we go out and talk with, not everybody necessarily from criminality, just through understanding of the legislation, has adopted it in the way it's supposed to be. And I think that's where our industry doesn't always get painted in a good light, because not necessarily because of the criminality, which does get the post, does get all of the press because it's sensationalism. But then there's the ones where it's, I didn't realize. And I think that's what we need to kind of help and get rid of. And that's what we hope with this survey.
And I think there is a lot of that I didn't realize, but I didn't realize that the private rented sector is so important to making sure. I mean, it's such a big piece of that pie, isn't it? When you look at housing provision generally, the public sector or social housing can only do so much. And you know, it's well documented about how stretched they are in terms of resources. The government haven't made
the PRS now, and for the last few years, has been more than both social and council combined. So it became the second biggest tenure ownership. The PRS then became the second. So I mean, it is huge into the economy. And there's a whole generation of people now that actually renting is their choice.
Yep. It gives them flexibility to live where they need to live, where they want to live. I think that's probably a big change. And I think that, you know, if you do get governments who do appreciate that, and they appreciate that it does make up such a big, significant proportion of the income that they then in turn receive as well, in terms of tax receipts and everything else. But most importantly, their obligations to the public to make sure that there is enough housing for the next generation. We've got to hopefully get to a point where the private rented sector is regarded a little bit more highly, and the results of surveys such as the one that you've just done become entirely more relevant to those discussions.
Yeah, and I mean, do you know, actually within government, I will give them their credit, because we've done a lot of lobbying and talking. The private rented sector isn't as vilified within the government as it seems to be within the public press. I think the press and the sensationalism of the stories has a lot.
A good headline takes precedence over everything else.
Absolutely. And so if you're only ever hearing about the bad stories and you are a tenant, then it is easy to believe that everybody who provides a service to a tenant is of the same ilk. The government doesn't view it that way. I do think there are differences to how they view the PRS and its future between Conservative and Labour. But I think both of them understand its, as you say, its importance to the economy. I think the difficulty that they've got in the environment that we're in is there is a lot of noise from tenant services about poor property and poor services. There's not enough in our industry, and the government says it, about us singing praises and things that are done well. And if they only ever hear the voting public giving one side of a story, it makes it very hard. You know, we talk about this industry and the fact that the Section 24 was one of the biggest killers to the landlord industry. And we have lots of landlords, but a petition went out to get it reviewed, and it couldn't even reach 100,000 signatures to get it reviewed by Parliament, because we're often quiet as an industry. And that's the reason we want to put the survey out and the reason that we lobby, we need to make sure that that good voice is heard. So it's not just the bad voice from the press or the tenant groups as the only thing that they hear. I'm not saying the tenant groups, the stories that they're saying are not valid. They're not making these up. They have bad experiences, and it's not for them to go and say the good experiences, but it is for us as an industry. We should be shouting out the good agents, the good landlords, the good suppliers.
Great.
Make sure there's enough of a noise.
We should definitely make noise, because we're certainly capable of doing it, you know, when we want to. We are marketing experts, each one of us, because that's what we have to do for a living. So getting a message out there shouldn't be too difficult for a group of people who are also quite well connected within their own communities. And I think it's about getting that out, into that discussion out into the wider public sense, but making it relevant for members of the public, making them understand why it's important to them, not just to us because it's a source of income to us, and not just to landlords who are sometimes vilified, but really, you know, it matters for their children, their grandchildren. In terms of the future, it is harder to get onto the home ownership ladder. Yeah. So we know that, and it's not going to get any easier. We know that rents are rising, so those costs are also rising, but we know that rental takes a lot of that strain out of the entire system. So I think people getting behind it, very interesting, and something we need to get that message out there. So wholeheartedly agree with you. We've talked about some very cerebral and lofty concepts today, and I'm going to bring us crash right back down to, we're talking to each other in the middle of August. It is peak holiday season, or as I like to call it, PayProp season, and I'm going to tell you why. One of the agents that I spoke to when I was talking about getting a testimonial for PayProp, they told me that they could not go on holiday previously because their rent runs were something that needed at least 2 people in their office to be doing, but it took so much of their time. There were separate elements to it. They couldn't do it all in one go, so they used to do it piecemeal. And now famously he stated that he goes on holiday, he still does the rent run, but he does it from the comfort of the poolside. So you know, that's an amazing accolade right there. And if you don't believe me, the statistics are there. you processed 2.3 billion pounds worth of rent in 2022 to 23 for over 500,000 active tenancies. We're not talking about something that's been slightly tested. You've been put through your paces. How do you feel when you hear that kind of feedback?
You know, I love it. I've been with the company for years, and that is the biggest thing that I know, that pound for pound, it is still the best thing an agent can do, is to take PayProp on. And actually the amount of people that then come and say it's transformed our business, that is what I do it for. Because I was an agent, and I was an archaic agent. I mean, I started for a lot of the wrong reasons, as I tell people. And when I did it, I was books. You know, my purchase and my sales ledger, they went everywhere with me. And when I first had my Rolodex of contacts, they were on a rollout with the corners cut off so I could get to the hot candidates quickly. The idea of a computer never even entered. And I've used lots of different systems over the time, but I actually saw PayProp before I actually approach it, as it was being looked at to enter the UK market. And I was just blown away with it, because I was like, if I was back as an agent, I'd have taken this. And when we get so many people that say, I wish I'd have taken it sooner, I can't believe how it's transformed our business, how are we doing it before? Even down to David Votto, who was at another business when he first saw it, and came to us and put it down. He said, I can tell you now, this is the first piece of software I'm buying for my business because I know I need it. And it's things like that, that's why we constantly need to be fighting and making sure that this product stays out there and stays relevant and helps people with compliance so that they can continue to have that peace of mind. And that's what I want. It's not, it can do this, it's got this button.
And in the day and age where we're having serious conversations about how AI might affect the future of you know, job security, we're all worried that a computer's going to take our job. Let's make this absolutely clear. Taking PayProp into your business and integrating it isn't there to replace anybody, But what it will do with that saved time, you can then utilize those skills and those resources that your team have, and have them actually doing things that are productive. So it's not a replacement, absolutely not, but it will give them time. And I'm sure there are
Your
loads
property
of
managers and your finance team didn't want to join an agency to become a glorified bank teller.
Yeah,
they
absolutely.
came because if they're finance, they want to add value. And if they're a property manager, they want to service customers. And that's all PayProp's doing. It's freeing them that time again so they can do what they want to do within their job.
Superb. And on that wonderful note, Neil, I'm going to wish you a pleasant summer and thank you very much for your time.
No problem at all. Pleasure as always, David.